Hey everybody, welcome to episode 5 of Startups and Code. Today we're going to be talking about process as a product and getting ready to get ready. Some of the topics I'm going to cover today is Waterfall, Six Sigma, Agile, Scrum, and then Kanban, and then the whole concept of process as a product. So thanks for tuning in and let's get started. All right, let's start with the getting ready to get ready. So, a lot of people will have all of these wonderful ideas and concepts and things like that, and then they immediately jump into, I'm going to start writing code. But they haven't taken the time to actually flesh out their idea and figure out what they actually are trying to build. There's some process that they need to implement initially of what is my idea? Who is going to be my persona? Who is going to be my primary audience? What is my MVP consist of? And those things. I talked about that in a previous episode, but understand that that is part of your process. As you continue to grow, you'll actually have more and more in regards to that process. Before you start writing a single line of code, understand what you're building, understand what problem you're solving. I'll leave that for the other episode. You can tune into that and play that again. So now let's talk about some of the processes that people follow to actually build their product. Back in the day, probably in the 80s and 90s, there was a process called Waterfall. And what would happen is an idea would come in, design would get it, design would then hand it to engineers, engineers would then hand it to QA, and then QA would finally approve it, and then it would go to production. And generally, that would be from the idea, they'd make sure they have the full concept fleshed out, and they have every concept design pixel perfect in their design. So when they hand it to the engineers, there aren't any questions. So the engineers would then take 6 to 8 months or maybe even longer and build a product. And then at the end of that 8 month cycle, it would go to QA. And then QA would test it and go back and forth with the engineers. And potentially the market may have shifted by then and they would realize that their product is no longer a market fit. And then all of that waterfall idea that they spent probably at least 2 years on from the design to the QA part is no longer a valid product. That's why there's new processes that came out. One of the other processes that a lot of people started moving into in the software world, which started in manufacturing, is called Six Sigma. Six Sigma started, I think, in Motorola in 1986, I think. Let me look that up. But yeah, it was 1986. So when that started, it was primarily used for manufacturing, and that is something to consider. So when it's been used in manufacturing, everyone's like, oh, wow, this process works really well for manufacturing. However, it doesn't work in software. It took a while for people to figure that out. And the question is why? Why did it take so long for people to figure that out? The main reason why is because people were making money at telling people how to actually use a process. It seems silly, but that's what happens. So they spent millions of dollars training people in Six Sigma. You become a green belt, then you become a black belt, and then you become a master black belt, I think is one of them. And they would put you through all of this rigorous training to understand this manufacturing process and then realize, oh, this doesn't work in software generally. And I don't want to say that one process is going to be the end all be all for everything, right? However, Six Sigma does not work in software in 90% of the cases. And I can promise you, I know firsthand that it does not work in startup world. Uh, it's too slow. The process is too over engineered and it does not work for startups, period. So let's get to the next one that everyone knows about. Agile. So Agile came out in 2001. There was an Agile manifesto that came out, and I actually signed that Agile manifesto. And that one was really kind of fascinating, but it actually had some basic concepts that everyone wanted to follow. Individuals and interactions over process and tools, one. Two, working software over comprehensive documentation. So you didn't need to spend 6 to 9 months building documentation, get enough documentation to actually start getting working software. And customer collaboration, number three, over contract negotiation. So you wanted to actually work with the customer and figure out exactly what they would want rather than contract negotiation up front on how you're going to do this. And responding to change, number four, over following a plan. So you got to understand there's a part of the manifesto that people don't follow through with, and that is the value on the items on the right, there is value in. However, we value the items on the left more. And I'll say it again. One, individuals' interactions over process and tools. It doesn't mean you don't use process and tools, but we value individuals and interactions over that. Working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. There are values in all of those concepts, but working software is the goal where you want to get a product out as fast as possible. And by doing that, you will actually have moved forward a lot faster than almost any organization that isn't following this process, let's just say. So that is Agile. Then Agile got introduced to the world and I would say modified with the concept of Scrum. Now, Scrum technically came out in 1995, but it really didn't take off until 2001 when the manifesto got very, very popular and everyone was like, I'm all about Agile. I'm going to be a Scrum Master. Now, Scrum is a really interesting concept because it is an implementation of Agile. It is not the end all be all answer for Agile. However, uh, it follows a lot more process. So some of the process that it follows are ceremonies that they have. So there are 5 events that Scrum actually has: sprint planning, the daily Scrum, a sprint review, the retrospective, and all of that is encompassed in what we call the sprint. Now, let me explain each one of those briefly. So, sprint planning is you're planning what tasks are going to be taken into the next sprint. You want to prioritize items. You want to make sure that those tickets are broken down to a place where you could actually perform those tasks and complete them in a given sprint. If a task is too big, you break it down until it's something that's demonstrable by the end of the sprint and consumable during that sprint. Then you have your daily scrum, daily stand up. So, what that means is you will actually have the entire team come together for 10 to 15 minutes and said, what did you work on yesterday? What are you working on today? And are you blocked? That's it. It is not a long, drawn out meeting. You have 3 things to state, and that's it. If you are blocked, then you can actually talk to someone else and say, hey, I need help. I'm blocked, and maybe you can help me. But that is after the entire team has actually discussed what they're working on and what they worked on previously. Then you'll have your sprint review. The sprint review is actually really important, and a lot of people skip this step. So, with the sprint review, you're actually demonstrating all the things that you completed in that sprint. It's really important to do that because if you don't do that, then your work that you did in the sprint may or may not have get completed. No one really knows if it works. And until you actually do a demonstration of what you've completed, it's kind of in the ether and ambiguous on what has actually been completed. And then finally is the sprint retrospective. This is the meeting that you have to talk about what went well, what could you do better, and what are you going to do next time? Whether it's something you're going to continue to do or something you're going to try differently in the next sprint. Sprints are usually 1 or 2 weeks. Sometimes they go to 3 weeks. And that is a time period of where whatever work is accepted into that sprint should be completed in that sprint. And then at the end of the sprint is when you do that sprint review and you will demonstrate what you're doing. And that's really important to understand. So that's a lot of ceremonies. That's a lot of meetings in my mind, especially for engineers, because engineers are most valuable when they're actually producing code and solving complex problems. That's why they got hired. You want to piss off an engineer, have them go to a bunch of meetings. Guaranteed. The goal as an engineering leader is to prevent them from going to those meetings, but give them enough information to do their job successfully. So they need the information and they need the tools to do their job. Sprint has been, the easiest way to put it is bastardized into this monolith teaching mechanism there where people could generate income of teaching people about a process. There's a lot of self-help books out there. There is a lot of education books out there. There is a lot of get rich schemes out there. Most of those people that are trying to get rich are actually selling you a plan on how to get rich. And they're getting rich by you buying their plan, not necessarily implementing it, but just buying the plan. And that's what Scrum became. So Scrum became a place where people would pay thousands of dollars to trainers that would come on site and give them an explanation on how to do Scrum by the book, how to actually make sure that you're doing it right. And it drives me nuts. I can't express that enough. So, Agile, the concept, is about agility, about change, about dealing with change, about movement, and about improving the process as you go along. So what I have seen is Scrum is actually very, very valuable for new teams as they're starting up, especially if they have no experience in any type of product management process. So what they do is they will start with Scrum and they will go through those ceremonies and then they're like, wow, these ceremonies seem like a lot. And what'll happen is your team will start improving and then realizing that this meeting isn't useful anymore, and then they'll reduce it. And then they'll reduce it again, and then they'll reduce it again. And what that is doing is actually improving on their own process by that sprint retrospective. And what I have seen more often than not is it eventually leads to Kanban, which is a process that was originated, I think, by Toyota in the 1950s. And what that was doing is you have a list of tasks on the board. Somebody takes the top task, they work on it until it is actually in the done column, and then they will grab the next task and they will keep doing that. And a lot of people will be like, well, upper management wants a demo on Thursday. Great. Whatever is in production is what's demonstrable. So they would do releases throughout the week, they would do releases all the time. And then while you would do those releases, whatever feature has been completed, aka tested, verified, and released to production, it's demonstrable, right? And as you move forward with this process, you start delivering tickets faster and faster. More and more features come through. The engineers have to go to less and less meetings, and their workflow is just a constant stream. And when those tickets from the quote groomed side or the priority side gets moved all the way to the done side, then that task is completed, project management is signed off on it, and is released in production. So one of the things that's really important when you do any type of process is have everyone on the same page on what the definition of done is. That is critical. If the definition of done for an engineer is it's on beta, and the definition of done for a client is it's working on my site. And the definition of done of a product manager might be I've submitted the ticket, right? So it's all different. And you have to understand that is everyone has their own perspective of what is important. And you have to agree that the definition of done is that the code is approved, working, and in production. Having a ticket on beta is not in production, not done. All right, so there's a quick overview of all the process of what we're talking about. So now let's get to the final part that I wanted to talk about, which is process as a actual product. Everyone likes to use all of these different things for products and go, oh, this is the product that I'm building. But take a step back and think of the process that you're using is the actual product. And when you think about that, you'll be like, well, yeah, I keep on iterating on my process and getting that a little bit better. So, whatever process you're using, whether you realize you're following one or not, you can actually improve it. And it might be just little tweaks here and there that will actually make it a better, more efficient process. And when you realize that that process that you have is something you can bundle and go, this is a product of our internal organization that we can use as a process. That is mind blowing to people because then everyone can get on board and they're like, oh, I want to help improve the process. And then you start getting the momentum of the entire organization of improving the product which is actually your internal process. So you might have a bunch of meetings to start out. Like I said, with Scrum is a great way to actually have all of those guardrails for new teams that are getting organized, figuring out how teams work together. There was an interview recently with Mark Ruffalo and Robert Downey Jr. talking about how their teams work together at this new movie they did. And it was fascinating because the first 10 days of the movie, all they did was do acting games together. They just played. They figured out how to work with each other. They figured out how to interact with each other. They figured out what makes them uncomfortable and how to get past that. Because when you're acting and doing working that closely with somebody, then you need to have that level of comfort, that level of trust, and you need that immediately to produce the emotional effect that you want in a movie. Well, imagine applying those same concepts to a team. When was the last time you joined an engineering team and you spent even an hour just playing with your team, just hanging out, chatting about whatever as part of the onboarding process? So like, oh, we have a new engineer. All right, we're all going to take a day and we're going to hang out with them and talk about engineering practices and some of the things we want to do and what your favorite hobbies are, and we're going to play video games together or play basketball or something, and do things outside of work to understand the individual and what motivates them and then how they're going to fit on that team. That will immediately build a level of camaraderie with the team, and then your process that you want to implement will actually go even better. And by doing that, you're one, taking them, truly investing in them as part of your team now, and not just let's see what you can do and how fast can you do it. You're taking an investment in them and working on making them as part of their team, because some of the people might have been on the team for 10, 15 years. Some of them might have been there for 2 to 3 weeks, but they want to see that the process that when they started is now been even improved for the next new hire. So that process will take things for the initial onboarding, and then we'll take them to the coding side of things, to the delivery of high quality items. And that's it. I mean, that's what I wanted to talk about today. So I want you to stop and think a little bit about what your process is. You're like, oh, well, I work at this large corporation. I don't care if you're at one of the FANG corporations or one of the large, what is it, the big three accounting firms. They still have process, right? But there's a process inside of that process, and there's a process that you can be part of. And see if you can improve your own process. Now, in startup world, you have a lot more leverage to actually improve the process because they're looking to you. You're like, hey, you've done this before. Let's see how you can do, and we're going to all ramp up together. I love startups for that reason because I will have an impact. I will have an impact on not necessarily just the process, but on the careers of different individuals that I work with. And that is something that really excites me. I get excited thinking about helping other people's career grows, seeing them get better at their skill set, and then seeing the company grow as a whole. Really enjoy doing that. For what you're doing right now, think about your process. Think about what little tweaks you can do in the next, let's say, 30 days. And I want to change this. Or sometimes you're like, I want to cancel this meeting, and let's see how that removal of that meeting will improve things. A lot of times removing things will actually improve your process without even trying. So think about that and let me know how it goes. Send me your ideas about process and products and what you're using at your startup. I'd love to hear from you. And that's it for today, and thanks for tuning in.